What's going on, you guys? So in this episode, I want to give you guys my 5 tips for turbocharging an LS engine. So I'm going to go over what I think are 5 of the more important things that you should do and always look at when you want to go turbocharged. So we're going to start the list off with number 5, which is the exhaust routing. So when doing a turbo kit, you want to make sure you have a proper exhaust routing on the car. You want to take into consideration exhaust sizing. I usually prefer to run a 3-inch exhaust system. Now, some people do step down to a 2.5 going into the turbo, and what that usually does is it increases the exhaust gas velocity going into the turbo, and it can improve spool time. Now, another thing you want to take into consideration is your exhaust housing, so the turbine housing on the actual turbocharger. The bigger that is, the later the spool is going to be, but the more top-end power it's going to make. And the reason it's going to make more power up top is because it can get more air out. A smaller housing will get that turbo up and spool up really, really quick, but you're going to be restricting the exhaust gas flow as it's coming out of the turbo in the higher RPM range. And what that's going to do is it's going to actually limit the amount of power you can make up top. So you need to find a balance between low-end torque or spool and the top-end power that you want to make. Also, when routing your exhaust system, take into consideration coolant hoses, wiring, stuff like that. I've seen so many guys make turbo kits that they route their exhaust basically resting on coolant hoses with wrap on it, and while it may help, it's not a good idea to do that. I usually like to keep at least a solid 1.5 inches away from anything else that it might be touching and wrap everything accordingly, because you want to keep the heat away from everything that you can. You want to keep it in, so you want to keep the heat in the exhaust and away from anything critical inside of the engine bay. Also, on the exhaust side, when you're routing your downpipe, say the outlet for your turbocharger is a 4-inch, you're going to want to try and keep that 4-inch exhaust routed as far out as you can. I see a lot of people downstep them to 2.5, 3-inch even, and you're basically choking up your turbocharger at that point. So the turbo is not going to be able to be nearly as effective as it should be if you're choking the exhaust down to that, because you can only get as much air into the engine as you can get out. And if you're choking it out at the exhaust, you're going to lose a lot of power on that. And since it's part of the exhaust, we'll cover that under this also, is wastegate sizes. Usually on the LS, I like to run dual 40mm wastegates minimum. That's because you're moving so much volume of exhaust out of the engine that when you need to open the wastegates up to control the boost level, you want to be able to remove as much exhaust as possible to have good control over the boost level. If you run a single 38mm wastegate, you might see pretty bad boost spikes because the wastegate cannot remove enough exhaust fast enough to bring the boost level down to where you need it to be. So always take into consideration running a good size wastegate. That way you can always have good control over your boost level without running into spiking issues. Number 4, know your engine specs. So before you go turbocharged, you want to know what your engine is. Displacement, compression ratio, how much does the head flow, what cam is in it, valve springs. You want to make sure you know everything about your engine so you can know exactly what you can put to it. Now, some people will say, oh, if it's a high compression engine, you can't boost it. If you have an 11-to-1 compression engine, you can't throw a boost at it. Well, that's not necessarily true. With the proper fuel, timing, you can easily boost an 11-to-1 compression engine. Some people just don't understand the difference between static compression and effective compression. So say you have an engine that's 8.5-to-1 compression. If you're throwing 25 pounds of boost at it, it's not an 8.5-to-1 effective compression ratio anymore. It's going to be way higher than 11-to-1. You're probably going to be up in the 16-to-1 effective compression range with that. But on the flip side, you want to know that you don't need to throw a ton of boost at it to make the same amount of power. So if a higher compression engine, say, I'm just ballparking numbers here because I haven't really done the math or looked any of it up, but say an 8-to-1 compression engine runs 20 pounds of boost. An 11-to-1 compression could make theoretically the same numbers on, say, 12 pounds of boost. You just have to have the right fuel and put the right ignition timing in it. That way you can do it safely and do it properly. But that all comes down to knowing your engine to know what you can put at it. Number 3, a good turbo goes a really long way. So I've seen people with similar setups to my vehicle running very, very similar turbos, but they were eBay journal bearing turbos and same boost levels. And with the same boost levels, my car was making over 100 foot-pounds of torque more than theirs. And why is that? Because I have a very, very good Garrett turbo on this car. I have a 4508R on here that spools almost instantly. Now you're getting that good torque number because you're picking all that power up down low in the RPM range. So you're making way more power down low, where these cheaper journal bearing turbos take a lot longer to spool up to make the same amount of power up top. So you're losing torque, but you're still making a similar horsepower range. And I've even seen the efficiency on some of those turbos to the point where you're not even making close to the same amount of horsepower, just because the efficiency of those cheaper turbos isn't nearly as good as some of the higher end stuff like the Garrett turbochargers. Number 2. This one is actually pretty important. It's knowing your ring gap. So on the LS engines, they usually run, I think, around a 15 thou ring gap. When you go boosted, you're gonna wanna open that ring gap up because you're creating more compression, more heat. And as you get hotter, those rings start closing up. And if you don't open that gap up, eventually what'll happen is the piston rings will touch, bend, and snap the ring lands off the piston. So you always wanna open up your ring gap when you're going turbocharged on the LS. I've seen plenty of failures where guys just throw big turbos on their cars, crank the boost up, throw fuel in it, pull timing the way it needs to be pulled, you know, basically get them dialed in and tuned, and then they'll still just crack the ring lands off of it because they didn't open the ring gap up properly. So that's a very important thing you need to do when turbocharging one of these engines. Now, I have seen guys just throw a ton of boost at junkyard 5.3s and 6 liters and live for a while, and you know, can it happen? Yeah. But it's not the right or correct way to do it. So if you're going to turbocharge an LS, I would highly, highly recommend opening up your piston ring gap. And finally, the number 1 tip I can give for turbocharging an LS: crankcase ventilation. The factory crankcase ventilation on these engines is absolute garbage. They are terrible for boosted applications. Now, yes, on the naturally aspirated engine, they work fine because they do pull vacuum. Now, ideally, you would want to have vacuum in your crankcase. You pick up horsepower, rings seal better when you do it that way, but on a boosted application, it's almost impossible to pull crankcase vacuum unless you're running dry sump. So the next best thing is to have the system ventilated, so you're not building pressure up, because it's far more important to have the system ventilated than actually building pressure up. So one of the big issues I see happen on these LSs all the time is people will throw prochargers, turbochargers, something like that on them, and they'll just run off the factory crankcase vacuum ports. That there's the one on the valve cover, the one off the valley pan usually, and they'll just run them to the front of the intake, or even just vent those tiny little tubes to atmosphere even, and it's not enough to let the pressure out of the crankcase with the turbocharger with some of the blow-by you're gonna get through the piston ring gap. And what'll happen is you're gonna be blowing out rear main seals, you're gonna blow out crank seals. I've seen valve seals get pushed out, and it can be a whole disaster waiting to happen. So what I do to fix that, and it's worked great for me, is I usually run 2 12AN size lines off each valve cover over to an overly sized catch tank, because even the little tiny ones that they make can fill up pretty quickly, especially if you're running E85, and that seems to do the trick pretty well. And I've never had any front seals or main seals blow out when I do it that way. And the last thing you want to do is blow out a seal on the track and pour oil all over the place, shut the track down. Everybody's mad at you for doing it, and you know, it's a headache you don't want to deal with. Ventilate your crankcase. It's the biggest piece of advice I could give you for turbocharging one of these LS engines. Now, yes, there are plenty of more important things when it comes to turbocharging an LS engine, such as fuel system, charge pipe routing, intercooler system, drivetrain support mods, and actual internal engine mods. But I just wanted to give you guys what I thought my top 5 important things to cover when going turbocharged on an LS were. And I'm sure I'm gonna get reminded down in the comments of all the reasons I'm wrong about a bunch of stuff too. But there you go. If you guys have any other questions, leave them down below. I'll try to get around to answering as many as I can. So that's gonna be it for this one though. So like the video if you liked it, subscribe to the channel if you're new, follow the builds along, and until the next one, I'll catch you guys later. And if you are new to my channel and have not seen my build, this is my turbo LS setup that I built. It is a 5.7 liter, 10.5 to 1 compression engine, dual 40mm wastegate with a Garrett GTX 4508R turbocharger. We are running a 3-inch, both sides collected into the turbine housing, with a 4-inch exhaust all the way out the back. We're running an air-to-water style intercooler, and the hot side is a 1.01, I believe. It might be a 1.15. I'm not too sure. I don't really remember. I think it's a 1.01. But we went with the smaller hot side just to increase the spool up a little bit. We are going to lose a little bit on the top end power, but with this setup, we make about 650 wheel horsepower at 9 pounds of boost. And we're running 110 octane race fuel on this as well, with super conservative timing, so plenty of room to go up in this if we really wanted to. Also, the engine's like fully built top to bottom, so I mean we could probably crank 20 pounds of boost out of this if we really wanted to, but 650 is good enough for now.